My name is Patrick Cronin. I'm the Senior Director of the Asia Program at the Center for a New American Security, a small think tank where we are right now fully deployed for our annual conference, which is tomorrow at the JW Marriott. 1,100 of my closest friends will be there, so it's a big deal. And I'm literally an absentee employee at the moment, but I'm delighted to be here for a good cause. I wouldn't want to miss the annual conference of the International Council on Korean Studies, and particularly this distinguished panel, as we think through the major powers and the question of unification. Just 2 minutes before I start introducing and handing it over to the speakers, we're also working at CNAS on a project on Korean unification, the geopolitical consequences of it. We had a conference, in fact, that we co-hosted earlier this month. And I think there are 3 reasons to focus on the subject of Korean unification. And the reason I'm putting this out here is just to set an audit trail, because a lot of officials and other friends ask me, why are you focusing on Korean unification? Well, I think there are at least 3 fundamental reasons, and probably more. The first is simply that sudden change in North Korea remains possible. Nobody can predict the future. And we can go into that, and our speakers will. The second is that sudden change could bring the major powers into turmoil, if not open conflict. That's huge stakes, huge stakes. So all the more reason to be talking in advance of that. And then third and finally, and this is not an insignificant reason, that planning for unification sends certain messages to Pyongyang as well. Anyway, maybe our speakers will touch on some of these and threaded through their remarks. We've got 20 minutes or less by the 3 paper writers and 5 to 10 minutes by our 2 discussants. And our first presenter, and I'll turn to them to speak right after I introduce them, and I'll turn and then introduce the next one after, in this case, Gordon Chang finishes. Gordon Chang, as you know, is a prominent best-selling author, a graduate of Cornell Law School, a longtime analyst of China-Korea issues. Many U.S. officials, past and current, have looked optimistically to China to help resolve the North Korean question. And in Gordon's lengthy, well-footnoted paper, well-researched, entitled China and the Korean Peninsula, Why the Problems, he explains why such optimism may be increasingly misplaced. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Gordon Chang.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. China is opaque, and North Korea is even worse. So because of all of this, relations between the 2 People's Republic are hard to understand. But unfortunately, that is my topic. So let's get started. Despite the lack of transparency, there are certain things we know. So for instance, the ties between both North Korea and China are troubled at this point, and they look like they're getting worse. Well, why? I think we need to focus on 2 principal reasons. First of all, both China and North Korea, both of these states, are going through troubled leadership transitions, which are changing decades-old patterns of governance. And because of this, I think the instability inside these 2 countries is affecting their external relations. And second of all, Chinese and North Korean policies now undercut each other more than in the past. So we'll begin with the first reason, which is internal turbulence. And to do that, we need to begin talking about that overfed little villain, Kim Jong-un. Now, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the people of North Korea, he took more than 2 decades to get Kim Jong-il, his son, ready to be the next leader. He started sometime in the 1960s, and by the time of his fatal heart attack in 1994, Kim Jong-il was really ready to manage this transition for his benefit. So at the end of the 3-year mourning period in 1997, I think that Kim Jong-il probably had consolidated his control. Now, Kim Jong-il was not as far-sighted as his father, and so he started training his son, Kim Jong-un, only about 2 years before his death. And this grooming didn't start until Kim Jong-il had his stroke, which was sometime in the second half of 2008, probably August. The result is that Kim Jong-un did not have the time to learn the complex ways of the North Korean regime. And as somebody called Bruce Bechtol has said, all Kim rulers have to master a complex balancing act, really to master the 3 main elements of the North Korean regime: Korean Workers' Party, Korean People's Army, and the security services. These all have to be in alignment, and at the same time, he's got to make sure, the Korean ruler has got to make sure that he keeps members of his family happy. So moreover, Kim Jong-un did not have time to put his loyalists into key positions in Pyongyang, and that certainly is an essential task in any transition. Because Kim Jong-il realized that he probably was starting too late, he also appointed 2 regents. One of them his sister, and the other his sister's husband, Jun Song-tak. Now, these 2 protectors, and especially the ambitious and avaricious Jun Song-tak, really created problems for Kim Jong-un. But despite all of these disadvantages, most analysts believe that Kim Jong-un took command of the regime very quickly. Yet there are reasons to doubt these assessments because today it looks like Kim Jong-un's grip on power is precarious and maybe exceedingly so. So for one thing, there is constant change in the one institution that matters most, which is the Korean People's Army. In a space of less than 4 years, Kim Jong-un has replaced his army chief 4 times. And that is in comparison to his dad, Kim Jong-il, who changed his army chief only 3 times within the space of about 18 years. Also, we know that the turmoil at the top of the ranks is continuing because General Hun Yong-chol, the defense minister, was reported to have been executed at a Korean military academy somewhere near Pyongyang, perhaps at the end of April. And the killings of this general take on added significance because it comes soon after, in February, the reporting of the execution of another 4-star, Pyun In-sun. And to put this into even deeper context, there have been a number of executions throughout the regime. South Korea's National Intelligence Service reports that 83 senior officials were executed between the beginning of 2012 and the end of April of this year. And in addition, since that time, there have been reports that high-ranking officers have disappeared after the execution of the defense minister. In contrast, Kim Jong-il is said to have put to death only 10 officials within the first 4 years of his rule. So Kim Jong-un's reported death toll, as high as it is, actually may understate the magnitude of the purge. Because when you add in junior officers and officials, you perhaps are talking about a death toll that approaches 500. Because you've got to talk about people who have been disappeared, people put into the camps where they die. So, the most important execution of all of these, whether it's only 83 or it's as much as 500, of course the most important execution was that of Jun Song-tak, one of the regents and certainly the uncle of Kim Jong-un. Now, after killing Kim Jong-un then went after his vast and nationwide patronage network. And what we saw were people were purged, officials were killed, and also family members of Jun Song-tak were put to death. Now, most foreign observers are not really troubled by all of this bloodletting. So, for instance, the oft-quoted Andrei Lonkov says, well, Kim Jong-un appears to be secure. Yet I disagree, because I'm going to go back to my old friend Bruce Bechtol, who says that serial purges are not a sign of strength. They are indeed a symptom of continuing instability. And Victor Cha says, if you got a transition that's lasting 4 years, it's not a transition. So there is turmoil in North Korea, and part of it is not only because Kim Jong-un is trying to reshuffle officials and military officers, but it's also, I think, he's trying to change the nature of the regime itself. Now, Kim Il-sung created a one-man system where no one constituent element dominated. So he kept all of these elements, the army, the security services, and the party, and they kept them all surveilling each other, challenging each other, and also reporting on each other. So Kim Il-sung developed this system where all of these elements were balanced and revolving around himself. Now, the great leader was really good at this. His son, Kim Jong-il, probably less so. And so what we saw Kim Jong-il trying to rapidly develop a political base because he was much weaker politically than his father. And his solution was to really give power to the army. And that, in a nutshell, is Songgong, military-first politics. Now, Jun Song-tak actually tried to bring the party back from the margins of power. And as he did that, I think the flag officers have been fighting back. And that's why Kim Jong-un has purged relatively few from the Korean Workers' Party and few from the Ministry of State Security. And this suggests that going forward, this deadly game of regime politics is going to continue to be centered really at the top of the Korean People's Army. Now, further deadly disagreements between the Kim family and the country's most powerful institution are certainly not very good for the DPRK. And the resort to this ultimate punishment that Kim Jong-un has been using really, I think, is going to undermine him. We saw this, for instance, in Stalin's Soviet Union, where you had serial purges. The spilling of blood creates a dynamic that is hard to stop. So when Kim Jong-un kills somebody, yes, that intimidates others, but it also creates enemies who then have to be eliminated. Blood, after all, demands more blood. Moreover, when you have a murderous leader, it provides incentives for people to undermine the regime. So I think that essentially that if you have one execution, you are going to convince those who feel threatened to make a choice, to either flee North Korea or to kill Kim. So it's no surprise then that the pace of executions have indeed been increasing recently, and that's why I think that Kim Jong-un, despite being at the apex of political power for basically 4 years, is probably no more secure today than when his father died in December 2011. So, where does this leave us? Purges in North Korea are being matched by purges in China. And China is also undergoing this historic leadership transition, and I think it also is, despite what most people say, I think it's also unstable. Now, most analysts think that Xi Jinping quickly consolidated power after he became the Communist Party's General Secretary in December 2012. In fact, there have been complications in the Chinese transition, and the most important of these complications has been the wide-ranging purge of officials, both senior and junior. Now, new Chinese communist leaders always clean house when they take over, but what is different is the scope and the duration of Xi Jinping's purges. This unprecedented prosecution, I think, threatens the basis of Communist Party rule by deconstructing those patronage webs that have in the past really been the basis of the ruling organization's power. So Xi's relentless campaign, many people say, is proof that he dominates the political system. Yet, as in North Korea, going back to Bechtol, I think that we can probably say that these serial purges in China are also a symbol of his weakness. Now, if Xi Jinping were as strong as everybody tells us, then why would there be more need for this continued bloodletting? Now, Xi has roiled the political system, breaking decades-old norms that were designed to ensure stability. So for almost 4 decades in the Communist Party, there has been this complex balancing process by power brokers, and they have tried to make sure that everybody at the senior levels, whatever faction, whatever group, or whatever coalition, were happy. But Xi Jinping's motto has been described as, "You die, I live." So therefore, I think this unprecedented action marks the end of a quarter-century of stability in China. And this is the time when China has actually recovered from the disastrous 27 years of Mao Zedong's rule. So at this moment, I think the Communist Party in China is headed to another round of destabilizing leadership fighting. And we can see this from all of the coup plots and assassination rumors over the last 2 or 3 years, which they basically started in just before Xi Jinping took power in early 2012 and have continued into 2014 and indeed even into this year. So I think these rumors tell us that clearly something is amiss among senior elite members. Because the fact that you have terrified and desperate politicians who are continually spreading rumors of armored cars in the center of Beijing or gunfire in the Communist Party leadership compound of Zhongnan High tells us that people are trying to destabilize the regime. So Xi Jinping, I think, has actually created a situation where people believe that they have a choice. They have a choice to support or they have a choice to fight. Now, what does this mean for the People's Liberation Army? I think that in this turmoil among civilian leaders, we have seen the generals and admirals become much more influential, not only in policy, but also in society itself. And Chinese flag officers are now making their military diplomacy the diplomacy of the country. Just a couple days ago, the Wall Street Journal talked about Xi Jinping's impulsive style. And people were saying, well, this is because he's so strong, he's now trying to implement policies that haven't been vetted. But I actually also think that this could be a reflection of senior officers in the military implementing their own policies with minimal or maybe even no oversight from civilians. So essentially what we have is, I think, political turmoil in China, which is complicating policymaking, and it decreases the effectiveness of China to deal with North Korea. It is no coincidence, I believe. I don't believe it could be a coincidence that you have leadership turmoil in both of these states at the same time, and their relationships with each other have deteriorated. Now, of course, not all of these recent troubles that we have seen between Beijing and Pyongyang can be attributed to internal strife, but I think that the leaders in both states now are more focused on their challenges at home and less on improving relations with the other. Now, the observable cooling of relations started with the execution of Jun Sung-tak because Kim Jong-un had delegated to him the relationships with China. So with the killing of Jun Sung-tak and the destruction of his patronage network, those people who worked for Jong, you had essentially a cutting off of ties with China's civilian diplomats and officials. Now, on the surface, military ties between China and North Korea also were hurt. But nonetheless, I think that under the surface, these relationships continued, and they continued to be quite good. But there are recent hints, however, that even these military ties are now taking a hint. So, for instance, when it was reported that General Pyun In-sung was executed, it was said that Kim Jong-un put him to death because the general refused to fire subordinates who had prior dealings with their Chinese counterparts. These mill-to-mill relations have been the one stabilizing element in China's and North Korea's relations, especially because, you know, the DPRK is the world's most militarized state. So if you have a deep rupture in these military ties, it really means that between these two countries, between China and North Korea, you will have a rupture that will be deep and hard to repair. Now, Donald Kirk, who's the analyst who writes about Korea, says that in the past you've often had troubles in Pyongyang which have not been reflected in problems with China. And that is indeed a perceptive assessment, but I think it's no longer true because now we have an insecure leader in Pyongyang who, in order to solidify his position, has essentially made China the enemy. Now, this, I think, is going to make it difficult for Beijing to exercise a stabilizing influence on North Korea going forward. And clearly we have seen Chinese exasperation with the North Koreans, and as a result, Beijing has tilted towards South Korea in probably the hope of doing this, that they can convince the North Koreans to try to move closer to China to prevent China from drifting to North Korea's mortal enemy, South Korea. Well, that's a great plan in theory, but the problem is Kim Jong-un has used the similar tactics by playing the Russia card. And indeed, it appears that Kim Jong-un's will is probably stronger than the Chinese will, because you're now starting to see senior Chinese foreign policy analysts writing in open sources talking about how it's now time to repair the roof before it rains, which is essentially meaning it's time to fix relations with North Korea before the Russians become too important in the Korean Peninsula. Now, these Chinese military officers, who have given this stability to the regime, of course, have had very close relations with their North Korean counterparts, but if those are no longer in place, then the stability between these two states is in question. Now, the second reason why there's going to be, I think, increasing troubles is because essentially we are seeing that Beijing's and Pyongyang's foreign policy goals are diverging. And it's not only because China is moving closer to South Korea, which was, of course, graphically illustrated by Xi Jinping's visit to Seoul in July 2014, the first time in history that a South Korean leader has gone, that a Chinese leader has gone to South Korea before going to the north. And indeed, Xi Jinping has not gone to North Korea, and Kim Jong-un has not gone to China. The other problem I think that you're having with Chinese and North Korean diplomacy is essentially the Norths want their nukes, and this undermines certain important Chinese goals. So for instance, as North Korea becomes more threatening, it's more reason for the United States to base forces in the region. There's also more reason for South Korea and Japan to opt for missile defense. And of course, it's pushing Japan to militarize, all of this undercutting Chinese foreign policy goals. So you put all of these things together, and you can see that going forward, probably relations between China and North Korea, which of course is once were very close, are probably going to diverge. And we are going to see much more in the way of contention between these two states, and maybe even a relationship that is less opaque, that is more opaque than it is today. Thank you.
Gordon, perfectly on time. Well done. Our second speaker, I guess by dint of the order up here physically, is James Kendall, Fellow for Common Challenges at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. I could add parenthetically that since Admiral Dennis Blair has become chairman of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, it's fundamentally transformed that little organization, and I think James Kendall's presence here and affiliation is a testament to that. He's a retired Marine with extensive global operational experience. He's got special depth on understanding Japan, including the fact that he was the Marine liaison to the Japan Self-Defense Forces, providing disaster relief following the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. The main thrust of James Kendall's paper is self-evident in the title, Japan and Korean Unification, Ambivalent Pragmatists. James, over to you.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Well, my paper seeks to explore the question of the possible role of Japan in Korean unification. What do the Japanese think about Korea and Korean unification? Why do they think that way? And how might it affect their security decision-making in the future? I've examined the question from a historical and cultural viewpoint, as well as a political one. The Japanese experience with Korea has certain recurring themes throughout history, and the themes build upon one another to produce a unique Japanese view of Korea. From the Mongol and Korean invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, and the Japanese invasion of the Korean Peninsula from under Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1592 to 1598, the Korean Peninsula has been both a threat and an opportunity for Japan strategically. During the 1880s, Jakob Meckel, he was the head of the German training mission to the Meiji Army and mentor to the Japanese Army, coined the phrase that Korea was a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan. The Meiji state didn't need much encouragement to turn its attention to the peninsula, but this phrase put it rather picturesquely and encapsulated the thought of many at the time. So under the Meiji emperor, Korea was opened by Japan, much as Perry had done to the Japanese themselves in 1876. And when the unequal Treaty of Kangwa was signed, they managed to push the Chinese out of Korea in 1895 in the Sino-Japanese War, producing the Treaty of Shimonoseki. They pushed out the Russians in 1905 and made Korea a protectorate under the Treaty of Portsmouth, and then finally annexing Korea outright in 1910, ushering in their harsh colonization of Korea, which lasted until 1945. Following World War II, Japan recognized reality and maintained a two-Korea policy. You have to look a little bit wider to also understand that Japan, kind of pushed by the United States, also did the same thing with China, recognizing the Republic of China as the de jure leader of China, but then setting up an active trade and unofficial relation with the PRC for most of the 1960s. Their post-Cold War policy, like that of everyone else, has pretty much resulted in stalemate and failure. Taking this into account, the salient characteristics of Japan's policy toward Korean unification is pragmatism. Japan prizes stability on the peninsula and fears the possibility of a potentially hostile, possibly nuclear-armed, united country across the Korea Strait. At the same time, the inflammatory behavior of North Korea and the prospect of a united democratic Korean state make change in the status quo seem attractive. However, such change would likely result from a chain of events that would be unattractively unpredictable and ruinously expensive for many of the sponsors concerned. Faced with these conflicting feelings, Japan hedges. If the DPRK did collapse, it would trigger the biggest humanitarian crisis in East Asia since the fall of Pol Pot in Cambodia. Refugees would flood overland into South Korea, Manchuria, and the Russian Far East, and by sea to Japan. Depending on the nature of the collapse, the North Korean military or parts of it may or may not hold together. The need for massive amounts of virtually everything will necessitate UN and ultimately foreign military assistance of some kind. This will be extremely sensitive, as the xenophobic North Koreans would resent any foreign intrusion, and some combat may even be possible. After the initial response, the rehabilitation of North Korea will be a massive undertaking. The best course of action for Japan would be to actively and very visibly participate in civilian relief efforts. Koreans of both the North and South would strenuously and possibly violently oppose any Japan Self-Defense Force operation on Korean soil. Plausible military missions for the Japan Self-Defense Force include maritime interdiction, maritime search and rescue, ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance activities, using their P-3C aircraft, P-1 patrol aircraft, and unmanned systems such as possibly Global Hawk, as well as providing satellite imagery. The mission of most concern to Japan, however, is a non-combatant evacuation operation, or NEO, of Japanese nationals trying to flee the Korean Peninsula in a crisis. Because it would involve landing Japanese soldiers and helicopters on Korean soil, this would be highly problematic, no matter where it happened. Much more discussion with South Korea and the United States is required for this to be a viable option. Now let's think about that. A little anecdote: when I was a student at the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, we had a delegation visit us from South Korea's National Defense University, our counterpart. NIDS is Japanese equivalent of National War College, NDU, on our side. And students that we had instructions come down from on high that we, the students, had to generate questions to ask for the Koreans, our Korean counterparts, when they visited. And so we got together in our small groups and started looking at what we might want to ask the Koreans. Nobody could come up with anything. No one knew any questions that they might want to ask a South Korean counterpart, and nobody really knew much about the South Korean armed forces or the situation in Korea at all. As a matter of fact, a couple of the officers in my Han, my small group, who were by no means idiots, didn't even know that the ROK Army was maintained by conscription. They had no idea. And this basic level of ignorance from at least the Japanese part, and I assume there's similar on the South Korean part, is a real impediment to going forward. There's good senior formal and informal mill-to-mill relations between the Self-Defense Force and the ROK Armed Forces, but certainly at even the senior levels, the sort of 06 captain colonel level, there really isn't much at all. The militaries are largely strangers to each other. This also carried over to an academic sense. I attended a couple of seminars there, quarter-long seminars, and The students in the seminars, there was an elective, were all the foreign students and Japanese civilians. There were no military participants. Not their problem, something they're just not interested in. Take that as you make of it what you like. Japanese soft power should then come to the fore in helping the Koreas chart their recovery in the event of a sudden reunification. The ROK would certainly expect Japan to pay for a large share of the reconstruction costs of North Korea. This might entail Japan paying North Korea's share of reparations, adjusted for inflation naturally, since the 1965 agreement. And to give you a perspective, in 1965, the Japanese paid, they don't call them reparations, there's a long reason why. They don't call them reparations, but they paid South Korea $800 million. That's $6 billion in 2015 dollars. Bear in mind that Japan is still reconstructing the northeast of the country, is getting ready for the Olympics, is building facilities in Okinawa and many other things as well, and they have well over 200% of GDP in debt right now. This is the Japan of today, is not the Japan of the 1960s. Indeed, South Korea realizes Japan's importance in any possible unification as far as their checkbook is concerned. And some experts in Korea, last week in fact, at a seminar, were reminding the government of South Korea of Japan's importance, however it might come about, and are recommending that the ROK government not alienate Japan by its rhetoric. The bottom line, faced with the prospects enumerated above, the least bad policy option from the Japanese point of view is maintenance of the status quo on the Korean Peninsula while endeavoring to rein in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs as best they can in cooperation with the other partners in the six-party talks. A divided Korea for Japan breaks the Korean dagger aimed at the heart of Japan off at the hilt.
James, thank you very much. Well, we've heard China is likely to become even more internally focused. Japan is hardly moving out of its fairly conservative, pragmatic view of potential for change. Doesn't seem to have a plan B, even though you said they're hedging. So that leaves the United States as the major power here, or at least represented on this panel, to determine what role and how it views this. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Bruce Bechtol, President of the International Council of Korean Studies, as you know, Associate Professor at Angelo State University, retired Marine as well, a prolific author, focused so much on North Korea and on U.S. North Korean policy. And the topic he's focused on is something he knows better than anyone I know, which is the North Korean military threat in 2015. So, Bruce, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. And I just want to say one more time, I'd like to personally thank Andrea and Dave for putting together a great conference. Can we have a hand for them? I'm personally very grateful. Well, we all have things that inspire us. And I am indeed inspired today because my daughter is a student at the University of Iowa, and I'm wearing my Hawkeye tie. So discussants beware. What I'm going to talk about today is advances in North Korean military capabilities and training, the reasons why we have seen these activities occur at such a torrid pace, and what it means for unification. And I'm really going to talk about developments in the North Korean military since the end of 2013. And what happened in 2013? Anyone? Bueller? Jungsang Tech was executed. So since that time, I'm going to talk about what's been going on. And I'm going to start with nukes. Everybody knows the North Korean nuke program has two types of nuclear weapons, plutonium and HEU. They've tested 3 times. Each time was excessively larger. The third time, it's debated about whether that was HEU or not. I'll let you intel guys who have access to classified material tell me that. We'll just ask in a phone booth later. But what's really been the debate of of the nuclear program over the past year or so has been the miniaturization debate. And I'm not talking about fiats. I'm talking about a nuclear warhead, probably a highly enriched uranium nuclear warhead that is small enough to go in a missile. And of course, anyone who reads a lot about North Korea and their military stuff, guys like Pat, who's written some great stuff on this recently, knows that the North Koreans, yes, they have the capability to put a warhead, a 500-kilogram warhead, on a nuclear missile. But that missile is the no-dong. The no-dong cannot hit the west coast of the United States or Texas. And so it's not the kind of threat to the United States that what really keeps people awake at night. The difference now is that we've had several people come out and say, intelligence officials and combatant commanders, NORAD and USFK, have come out and said they assess North Korea has the capability to put a nuclear warhead on an ICBM that can hit the United States, the KN-8. KN, as in Kilo November, in Morse code, as you know, that would be .08. And that weapon can hit the United States, they assess, and thus the debate about the missile, the warhead and the miniaturization. I would just like to say that as a guy who no longer has a clearance, I am but a lowly professor at a small college in the greatest state in the Union. But as far as I'm concerned, thanks for laughing, that was a courtesy laugh, I think. But as a guy looking at this from unclassified means, it's just very compelling to me that all of these high-ranking defense and intelligence officials have said they assess the North Koreans have that capability, and nobody's come out and said, no, they're wrong, no, he misspoke. No, they're all saying the same thing, and I watched General Scaparrotti say it on C-SPAN about 3 weeks ago. Yes, I'm a nerd. When John McCain asked him the question, and it's quite compelling. I don't think they would be saying this assessment if they didn't have some good reason, a reason that I have not seen in unclassified channels, but there's something. So after the conference, let's all get the intel guys in a circle and beat on them until they tell us what it is. I'm just kidding, guys. So there's that. That's been the big thing about North Korea's nuclear programs. Their missiles. Let me point out a few things that I think are very important. North Korea before 2013 had already built, deployed, proliferated Scud B, C, D, ER, Nodong, Musudan, Taepodong, and KN-2, which is their version of the SS-21. Advances include the Kilo November KN-08 road mobile missile, 3 stages, assessed to be operational but not yet tested, at least that I've seen. And that's the missile that goes with the miniaturized warhead. Some analysts, including a guy who was at RAND, poo-pooed North Korea's missile program about 2 years ago, saying, well, you know, they haven't really tested their missiles. And I just would like anyone who thinks North Korea hasn't tested their missiles a lot in the past to go back and look at the missiles Pakistan has tested, or the missiles Iran has tested, or Yemen, or Syria. North Korea has tested their missiles a lot. They also, as Gordon Chang kept telling me over and over and over again, and finally I started listening to him, I think I was drunk, the North Koreans have, in fact, we now have proof of, gotten some Chinese assistance. There's 2 ways I know of, and it's in my paper if you want a good sleeping aid. One is they've gotten GPS training, which, as you know, is very important for ballistic missiles. And the other is, as everyone now knows, those TELs, transporter erector launchers that they got for the KN-8. So I think that's important. We just discovered that in the past year and a half. The North Koreans have also made advances in a bigger booster rocket for the Taepodong series and improved the launch site in the northwestern part of the country. Missile tests in 2014 and 2015 were quite compelling. Please allow me to expound on that. Anyway, they tested what's called the FROG system, which is not an amphibian, as we two are. It is a free rocket over ground. I've never seen them test frogs, ever. I was an intel guy for 26 years. I never saw them test frogs. Last year, they tested them about 70 times. They've also tested Scuds. This is all in the past year. Scuds, no-dongs with a modified anti-BMD firing angle. In other words, an angle that takes it up so that Aegis-equipped ships find it difficult to shoot it down. They're equivalent of the SS-21, which they call the KN-2, which has a CEP of 100 meters, can hit targets accurately, and then move away quickly because it's on a transporter erector launcher. They have about 30 launchers for that, about 100 KN-2s. How many people here know what CEP is? How many people here don't have a clue? How many people have seen Three Faces of Eve? John Woodward, 1958 Academy Award winning performance, not important. Anyway, CEP is essentially the circle that you would draw around a missile when it lands of how accurate it is. And the KN-2 is accurate to within about a 100-meter circle, which means they could attack military bases, they could attack flight lines, etc. Getting better. The Musudon has been tested in Iran, even though people say over and over again it's never been tested. It hasn't been tested on North Korean soil. It's been tested in Iran. North Korea sold 18 systems to Iran in 2005. Iran tested it in 2006 to a range of 4,000 kilometers. Thought I'd pass that on. It's in my first two books, available on Amazon.com, $29.95. So those who think that this Musudon threat is not credible, I'd like to remind you what happened last year. The North Koreans actually pulled their Musudon missiles out and they put them on launchers. And they knew we were watching them on imagery, so they'd raise the missile, then they'd lower the missile, then they'd put it in a shed, then they'd pull it out, then they'd raise the missile. Meanwhile, our guys are going crazy. We actually deployed the THAAD system to Guam. So if you don't think the no-don's a legitimate threat, maybe you'd better give the Pentagon a phone call. Dial 1-800-MISSILE-THREAT. I'm kidding. So if we're talking about another missile, the missile I was talking about before that goes with that warhead, the KN-08, this has become the big focus of the intel community and DOD. High-ranking intel officials, I already talked about that, and DOD officials have testified in open fora that they believe this assessment. Here's why it's so important. One, it can be armed with a nuclear warhead, they assess. Two, it can hit the USA. Those are two pretty compelling things that North Korea doesn't have in any other missiles right now, except perhaps the Taepodong. But the Taepodong, we can watch them load it for 2 weeks and then just take it out. This new ICBM is on a mobile launcher, which means they can move it anywhere and makes it very hard for us to take it out. So important stuff. Let's talk about North Korean maritime advances. I'm going to hit you with a lot of stuff here. They have come up with an advanced KH-35 anti-ship missile that is a threat to all of the South Korean ships except for stuff like Aegis-equipped ships. In other words, about 60% of the ROK Navy. They have made improvements to their Najin-class frigates with weaponry. That's the largest ship they have. They've made improvements to their catamaran-hulled patrol craft that incorporates stealth technology into the hull, so it's harder for U.S. and ROK Navy assets to take them out. They've also developed a vessel that has capabilities that are stealth capabilities and cruises right along the edge of the water and is more effective and faster than the current landing craft personnel air cushion that they have, or LCPAs, and is heavily armored and can launch special operations forces. They also have developed their own version, apparently, of a Gulf-class submarine. Now, why is a Gulf-class submarine so important? I'll answer that. Because a Gulf-class submarine can launch an SLBM. That does not mean silly little bad man, stands for Submarine Launch Ballistic Missile. And they've come up with a missile to match the submarine. So what we're seeing now, and we saw it tested recently, the North Koreans claimed that the test was successful, was we actually saw them in their own pictures launching what they claimed was an SLBM. What it probably was a barge underwater that was testing the ejector launcher to launch the SLBM, which means they're making steps in giving themselves A, a submarine with the range to hit Hawaii, and B, the missile to hit Hawaii. How many people here have been to Honolulu? A lot, right? How much empty space is there in Honolulu? Not a lot. I'm answering for you. So if you shoot an SLBM in Honolulu, you don't have to aim at anything except the city of Honolulu, or the island of Hawaii. So you miss Honolulu and kill everyone in Kaneohe instead. You get my point. South Korean Ministry of National Defense officials have said 2 to 5 years before it becomes operational. American officials have said 3 to 5 years. Some people have said it looks operational now. I don't know. But they're developing this thing, this whole system, at lightning speed. So let's talk about the North Korean air and ground forces. North Korea has made several advances in drones, UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. 2 advances that I think are significant is what looks to be a Chinese-developed drone, and another one that looks like it's a version of the American-made Streaker drone. So interesting stuff. They have changed the camouflage on their AN-2s, which means the AN-2s can infiltrate more effectively, and they trained about 15,000 SOF last year jumping out of AN-2s. They have increased their number of armored personnel carriers by 300 in the past 3 years, and they improved their Songun Ho battle tank with improved rocket launchers and SA-16 missiles. They have also come up with a multiple rocket launcher that has a range of about 170 kilometers, which means they could sit at the DMZ and target ROK military headquarters in Daejeon from the DMZ. And this will significantly improve their quick strike capability. Well, what have they done with all this stuff? Well, the past year, the exercises and training have significantly taken a step up. We've seen significant numbers, scope, and focus on chemical and biological weapons exercises. Very interesting. Thus far, in just 2015, we've seen recoilless rifle drills. We've seen large-scale drills with MiG-23s, 29s, and Su-25s. We've seen large-scale river crossing drills, anti-naval exercise drills, and an exercise with SOF troops and infiltration craft simulating an attack on Incheon Airport. They also, by accident, revealed what they call their 7-day war plan for invading the South, which not surprisingly consists largely of SOF and long-range artillery and missiles putting cracks in the ROK U.S. defenses, and then the more traditional mechanized and infantry forces pouring into those cracks. And finally, the most neato thing that I did, of course, you know what Jews do on Christmas Day, right? Chinese food in a movie, it's what we do. So on Christmas Day, my family watched, guess which movie? The Interview, right? So everybody knows about the cyber warfare against Sony and all that, but what kind of got lost in the shuffle of all that and the white noise was they have been attacking South Korean business, government, and NGOs. Even HRNK was attacked. They've been attacking military sites for the past 3.5 years, really. It's really stepped up since then. They have about 6,000 cyber warriors. I'm wondering what a cyber warrior looks like as a guy with tape on his glasses. I'm a cyber warrior. But they have about 6,000 of those guys, and they've proven to be very effective. So, I'm going to be right on time, Pat, because I don't want you to hit me. Okay. They have proven to be very effective. But what does all this mean? And I got called by a very nice lady who works for the Washington Post and is in Japan just Monday. And she said, Bruce, please tell me what all this means. And so this is my assessment of what this means. Based on the evidence, one would tend to believe there are 2 key reasons why there has been a flurry of diverse military activity in North Korea since late 2013. The first reason is that it may be a reaction to the increase in unification planning and focus that has been coming from Seoul during this same time period. This increased focus on unification may be a motivator for Pyongyang to show it remains a strong military power, having no intention of compromising with the South. In fact, this is what we've actually seen during the Kim Jong-un regime. There has been no real engagement, and the focus has been showing off and developing new and advanced weapon systems that would be used for offensive purposes against South Korea and or the United States. But there's another reason that North Korea may be conducting this flurry of activity relating to its military. Kim Jong-un has not fully consolidated his power in the three institutions in the DPRK. And Gordon talked about this: the party, the security services, and the military. But the military has been the institution with the most instability. The constant rotating of senior-level uniformed officials, the purges and executions, the anecdotal reports of corruption and moral issues in a number of units, and the high number of defense chiefs is evidence that Kim is still attempting to build a power base in the military, but has not even come close to building the loyalty and security that his father commanded. Thus, one way to gain credibility with the military would be to support the building of new systems, to provide resources for advanced and sophisticated exercises, and to take a strong military approach in policymaking. And what have we seen? So, it is not clear, at least not completely clear to me, if the DPRK's reasons for stepped-up military activity over the past 18 months are internal or external, or both. What is clear is that Kim Jong-un continues to struggle to consolidate his power and to maintain stability with the North Korean government. Unless or until this happens, to the degree that North Korea becomes more stable, there will be many challenges to establishing realistic engagement that could one day lead to peaceful unification. And I think I'll stop there.
Well, Bruce, with a lot of humor, you gave us a lot of very serious fodder as well for thought, and including tying back to the two previous presentations about the role that China's playing. I was thinking on the technology side, or to what extent Russia fills some of the gap on the technology, especially when you think about cyberspace. On Japan, one of the questions that James didn't get to was the question of the whole approach to North Korea, looking for that rapprochement, or at least the abduction issue that Prime Minister Abe flirted with for so much and then was kind of rebuffed and now is kind of retreated on that issue. We'll come back maybe to those and other issues with our discussants. And we're going to turn first to Dr. Andrew Scobell, Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation, holds a PhD from Columbia University, co-author of, among other things, a very important book that was recently issued in paperback. The book I have in mind is China's Search for Security. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. Thanks to the organizers for including me. I want to go back a little bit further in history than some of my fellow panelists did, but not as far as others did. 1876. Anyone know what happened on this day in 1876? Custer got massacred. Yeah. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, we remember the loser, right? Why do we remember? We don't remember the victor in that battle. Of course, it's another case of classic case of winning the battle but losing the war. Native American, the Sioux Indians. But I bring that up because we think about the Korean War, and what are we still fixated on? We're fixated on the losers. That's what we're talking about, the losers today. And of course, the losers in Beijing and Pyongyang don't think of themselves as being losers. And I guess that's a big part of the problem, because they haven't fully come to grips with the Korean War. And in their eyes, it still really isn't over. So getting back to the panel itself, we've had some great papers and great presentations. I think Gordon Chang's makes a really good argument that both China and North Korea are undergoing troubled leadership transitions. James Kendall makes a good case that Japan's policy toward is really about maintaining stability and the status quo on the Korean Peninsula because it's the least worst option. Bruce makes, I think, a very persuasive argument that there's still a multidimensional North Korean threat out there, and we shouldn't take it lightly just because the face of North Korea looks like a buffoon. said he used a lot of humor, as was noted, but the subject is very serious. Bruce asks a couple of questions, which he just answered. Why continued WMD and missile development? Why provocations continued provocations under Kim Jong-un? And of course, he gave us his answers. But one of his arguments or points here is that, of course, Kim Jong-un has not yet consolidated his power. I think we need to step back a little bit and ask another question, because North Korea didn't just start provocations when Kim Jong-un took over. North Korea has been in the provocation business for decades. So I want to ask the question about some questions about North Korea and some questions about China. On North Korea, is something seriously wrong, as Victor Charles quoted in Gordon paper in North Korea, or is it simply business as usual? As far as China is concerned, is Xi Jinping the strongest Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping? Some say since Mao Zedong. And is he firmly in charge, or has Xi been so vigorous and so ambitious that he's unleashed forces that are beyond his control and perhaps threaten the very existence of Communist Party rule? I think we tend to focus on leaders, especially colorful ones or decisive ones. Kim Jong-un, I've already referred to. He's young and cartoonish or buffoonish. Pick your descriptor. Xi Jinping looks like the barrel-chested strong man, right? So we're fixated on leaders, and that's understandable. They are the personifications of the countries and the regimes they lead. But I want to ask the question, as a recovering political scientist, what kind of political system are we talking about? Now, you may say, well, unless you're majoring in government at Georgetown or something, or getting a PhD, or you already have one in hand, you may say, well, who cares? Well, I think the point I want to make is it matters what kind of political systems we're talking about. Why? Because it influences the prospects for continuity and the possibilities for change, both within those countries and in their foreign policies as well. So I think that's my starting point. It matters what kind of political systems we're talking about. Just to touch on Japan, pretty clear. It's a democracy, parliamentary system. It has its problems, but it's fairly stable. And I don't think anyone's expecting there to be a regime change in Japan in the foreseeable future, at least. North Korea and China, on the other hand, are rife with speculation, and we're certainly engaged in that discussion or debate today. But I would suggest that the best way to describe North Korea still is as a totalitarian system. All right. So what are the hallmarks of totalitarianism? They're purges, executions. What have we been seeing in North Korea? Purges, executions. Okay. Are they manifestations of instability, or is it business as usual? Now, I've learned a lot from a number of people in this room about North Korea. I don't claim to be an expert, although I like to pretend I am sometimes. But I simply suggest that we question assumptions. The names like Stalin and Mao have been thrown around, right? When there were purges in Stalin's Soviet Union, when there were purges in Mao's China, did we take that as evidence of insecurity or problems, challenges to the leaders of these countries? Yes, there was some speculation. But both Mao and Stalin managed to endure for a number of decades, right? And I think we should be open to the possibility that that could happen in North Korea as well. A climate of terror, uncertainty, that's what these systems thrive on. And just because you execute your uncle, does that make you a madman? It's actually, I would suggest, a very rational, shrewd, calculated move. right? If you execute your uncle, then who is safe? No one is safe. And if you're scared bleepless, right, the last thing on your mind is trying to organize resistance or counter such a leader. You're either going to maybe try and exit from North Korea, or at the very least, you're going to keep your nose clean and keep a low profile and try and really keep in the good graces of Kim 3.0. Now, the one unusual factor about North Korea is, of course, I would argue it's the longest running totalitarian regime in the world, right? It's the only one to have successfully weathered 2 hereditary successions, right? So it is unusual. And so drawing comparisons with other totalitarian regimes, we have to be careful about how far we take those parallels. But I would suggest that we want to question some of the assumptions we're making about what's going on in North Korea today. Let's go to China. Move on to China. Now, China is certainly not totalitarian, but I would suggest under Mao Zedong, it did approximate a totalitarian regime. What kind of regime do we have in China today? It's not your run-of-the-mill garden variety authoritarian or aka dictatorship today, right? I would say it's a post-totalitarian regime. So what is this guy talking about up there, that recovering political scientist who thinks he's from the Rand Corporation? And I didn't write that report, by the way, that you referred to.
I should have said that, yeah.
But honestly, there are legacies, there are holdovers from the Maoist era, and they're still present in China today. They still permeate the political system. So one of the things that we see in China today is, as Gordon pointed out, are purges, right? It's called an anti-corruption campaign officially, but it's really a purge, right? You find people who happen to be corrupt. Oh, by the way, they tend to be in rival factions. And so that's, the standard response in a totalitarian regime to policy problems, and I would suggest in a post-totalitarian regime like I think we have in China today, is mobilization, a movement. That's what you see. That's what you see on a range of fronts in China today. So it's certainly qualitatively different what we see in the system we have in China today to what exists in North Korea, but there are some similarities because of their common political and revolutionary roots. Okay, so I'm just going to try and wrap up here. So I agree with Gordon. I think turmoil is what is the order of the day in China, and it's also going to be the order of the day in North Korea. But I think it's going to be somewhat contained or controlled turmoil, limited turmoil. So the result will be both in Pyongyang and in Beijing, you have regimes that are inwardly focused. That doesn't mean they ignore external stimuli and foreign policy and so on. But what it means is they're focused on domestic matters, and so that influences how much time they have to focus on external issues and the way they respond to those. It's always useful to have to point to an external threat or an external enemy to justify things that you're doing, bad thing, negative or harsh things you're doing at home. As far as Japan's concerned, I agree with James. Japan's really hedging, and it's trying to maintain stability and uneasy stability on the Korean Peninsula, because that seems to be in its best interests. I agree with Bruce that North Korea presents a real military threat, and while I still believe that North Korea or the regime is undergoing what I call slow motion implosion. That the gradual undermining of that regime I talked about, but that could take years, It might even take decades. On that optimistic note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's also probably a good idea to remember that China's a $10 trillion economy. North Korea is the opposite. But anyway, let's go to our next discussant, Dr. Zhong Ra, who received his PhD at the University of Illinois, professor at Hollins University and Virginia Tech. Over to you, Dr. Ra.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here once again, and I thank the management for putting together this wonderful gathering. I wrote down most of what I'm about to say to compensate for my second language and the roughness of it. So with your understanding, I'll simply read most of it. With regard to, let me cut to the chase by saying, with regard to the Chang paper, I would like to raise two broad categories of questions that may compete with each other for the reality testing. Mr. Chang posits a fundamental transformation of the relationship between China and North Korea that in turn has served to undermine China's once unquestioned and unquestionable grip on North Korea with regard to the latter's dependence on the assistance from the former. Of course, even more deeply ingrained in their relationship, as we know, has to do with the ideological symmetry and the memory of China's intervention in the Korean War that literally saved North Korea's political neck. In the present paper, this change of relationship and the subsequent reduced force of China's persuasive power, if true, and I underscore the words if true, is attributed in turn to the visible, if curious, metamorphosis that the two nations have been undergoing in their regimen respectively. To that extent, Mr. Chang does a well-informed and insightfully laid out job, sufficiently convincing in establishing the causality. One question may be simply a request for further elaboration of the above thesis. For example, how does the mirror image relationship between the two nations' leadership ascendancy to power add or distract from the author's argument? I allude here to the Xi Jinping's institution building and North Korea's resurgence of the Workers' Party of Korea. This is what John Park calls a startling coordination of leadership transition in both countries. How does it comport with Professor Chang's main point? To be sure, Mr. Chang has mentioned this, but my wish list includes the need to crystallize this aspect of the relationship and more in detail, perhaps. For example, is this an independent variable powerful enough to account for China's reticence in actively intervening? Number two, the second question I would like to pose here is based on an essentially different basis of assumption we may make about the relationship between the two nations, that the mutual needs of the two may override whatever has contributed to the dilution of the previous force of alliance characterized by China's almost unilateral dominance. On the one hand, of course, as I mentioned, there is a suffocating dependence on the part of North Korea for Chinese assistance on food, energy, the military, and in addition, the lively and increasing trade relationship. On the other hand, China, as a signatory of the UN Resolution 1718 that later was stripped of its sanction provision, but the Resolution 2094 in its entirety, this has been seriously compromised by China's trepidation about the probability of its consequence, i.e., an explosion that is a war with the South, or an implosion with a subsequent regime instability that inter alia will produce a frightening prospect of tsunami of refugees coming across the northern border. In addition, the usefulness of North Korea to China as a buffer zone that keeps the United States, South Korea, and Japan at bay may be important, although its value may be receding of late. Then what about the indispensability of North Korea for China in regard to the latter's economic rivalry with India. The significant flow of munitions from North Korea to Pakistan, an arch enemy of India on its northwestern border, impels India to frequently take its eye off its frenetic pace of industrialization, thus benefiting China's competition with India. Now about the Bechtol paper, again, the thoughtfulness and the thoroughness of the author's research on the details of the contents of the military dimension raises a specter of horror in many different ways for the security of the peninsula and beyond. This is so especially given the increasing preparedness on both sides of the division. If we remember the fact that wars are not often triggered by rational calculus, but rather by its absence. Here, I would very much like to hear Professor Bechtol's illumination on the foreseeable consequence of South Korea's so-called proactive deterrence, launched after the 2010 provocations by the North, such as Cheonan and Yongbin affairs. From China's perspective, it means that if North Korea went to attack South Korea again, there would be proportional response from the South Korean military. It would trigger the destruction of the North Korea's command structure. The latest report informs us that the precision-guided South Korea's munitions would take out the statue of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. According to Thomas Schelling about the game of chicken, if you want to win the game and you are in one car and your adversary is in another, the most unambiguous way to send the signal of a serious intent is to rip off the steering wheel and throw it out the window. Finally, I regret very much that I'm not prepared to comment on Mr. Kendall's interesting paper, obviously. I literally saw that coming as I was driving from Virginia Tech this morning. So I understand the reason for its lateness, so I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful. Let me just open up with a return to Bruce Bechtol's very intriguing closing remarks, where he offered two possibilities to the Washington Post reporter, unnamed, about what does it all mean. And he suggested that North Korea's recent military assertiveness, modernization, but parenthetically not lethal use of force before his time in 2010, for instance, when we go back to the two lethal incidents that are most recent. What is the reason for this military assertiveness? And he offered the two ideas. One was this is a response to especially South Korean-driven plans for unification and a way to basically thrust it back in the face of the region and Seoul. The other was because of the lack of consolidation, particularly with the military, which is why you're trying to exercise the military. If you go back to Andrew Scobell's discussion of political science, and when authoritarian states lose authority, how do they transition? How do they regain authority? So we can see in China, as has been mentioned by a number of scholars, a move from ideology over the past decades to performance metrics, as Sam Huntington called them, starting with economic growth that's slowing. So now we have nationalism, now we have other types, and we have still fear and purges and anti-corruption that Gordon Chang was talking about. In North Korea, you don't really have the economic performance you can offer, at least not, the elite, yes, they're still bought off, I suppose, with some favors. But you're really dealing with the military prowess and investing in that, and then the fear and the elimination of opponents. So they can be more effective than the Chinese even, and just outright, and more spectacular as well in eliminating some of the opponents. But I wonder in particular what Gordon and James think about Bruce's thesis, and feel free for the discussants to come back in on the same question. Gordon?
I think the important thing is that you do have a militant state. Andrew talked about the nature of these regimes. Well, North Korea, throughout its history, whether it's been weak or strong, has really had one goal, and that is to absorb the South, because that really goes to the core of North Korea's legitimacy. So In good times and bad, I think the North Koreans will always develop weapons that will intimidate the South and will try to also intimidate the South's allies, especially the United States. And that's why I see, for instance, the development of the KN-08, which perhaps now can hit the northern part of California, Oregon, and whatever, but eventually. But not Texas. Thank God, thank God. But essentially, we're going to see 2 or 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever, down the road, they will not only be able to incinerate Austin, which they actually threatened in 2013.
I remember that.
Yes, I can imagine you do. But also the rest of the United States. And so that's why I tend to see it is, as Andrew talks about, you have to look at the nature of these regimes. And so therefore, I think it's the broader overview. And Andrew, just to mention, there are a lot of Chinese netizens who talk about the convergence of their country with North Korea. And they do this in the way by saying that China really is West Korea. And I think part of it is because, they are similar in a sense when they started out, where you had two strong men, Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, run their republics. And they did them in many of the same ways. But right now, of course, you've had 25 years, essentially, of peace in China. You've had a bureaucratized system, and many people thought that, despite the nature of the communist regime, that it really had transformed itself. But what we're seeing today, I think, is really Xi Jinping, who actually idolizes Mao and makes no bones about it, is taking China back to that model that we haven't seen since Deng Xiaoping took over at the end of 1978. So it is the nature of the regime, Bruce, and I agree with you. I think that that's the reason why they are developing these weapons, and they'll continue to do it. Good times and bad, whatever. They will do that because the nature of their regime is to unify the Korean Peninsula under their rule.
And James, either your view
Oh, well,
or-
by the way,
Go ahead.
New Jersey is the greatest state in the Union.
Yes. Well, we could
Underlined over there.
get into
Another
a debate, I'm sure.
totalitarian state.
James, either a Japanese view or your view about this thesis.
Well, look, we talked about the provocations of North Korea going back decades. I think for a while, certainly in the 90s and earlier part of the decade, you had a situation of a desperate situation that you could see paralleled in places like Russia. And so if you're going to be a country like North Korea, and to your mind, in a dangerous neighborhood, you have a heavily armed and neighbor in South Korea, supported by a superpower, and then your nemesis, Japan, just over the horizon, and also your own powerful supporter who is also building up. Then, if you want to be taken seriously, you've got to have the hardware to do it. If you want to shake people down, if you want to extract concessions and be listened to by the community in your neighborhood, then you've got to have the tools to do it. One of the goals, political goals of the North Koreans has been to enter into direct bilateral negotiations with the United States. We've averred, the United States has, and they need to get our attention. They need to have a way of getting us to take them seriously. Now, obviously, we're stepping up missile defense and things like that, but that's as much to deal with China and anti-access area denial capability than it has anything to do with North Korea. Although North Korea is a useful stalking horse for that end, and that applies to Japan as well. So, yeah, I think it's in the nature of North Korea to do this anyway, and pleasing political factions by giving them, kind of throwing them a bone of modernization and all that. But at the same time, they have security concerns. They need those security concerns to be met, and if they're able to do it, that's what they're going to do. And it's also useful in extracting concessions. So that's kind of what.
And Bruce, I wonder if, in your response here, because I want to hear from you on response to this, I want to throw in, and Dave Maxwell's sitting right here, so he can speak for himself, but somebody who's focused heavily on the psychological dimensions of the use of power and deployment and forces on the part of North Korea, what they're doing here, and just thinking of the a specific episode of Kim Jong-un arguing that he's just witnessed this brilliant SLBM launch, which, as you suggested, is probably this much less than meets the eye at this point.
But in advance, nevertheless. Yeah.
Absolutely working on it, but
Right.
nonetheless, what he's doing psychologically here, just try to explain that in the thesis as well.
That's interesting, because I think that that's an example of them trying to say they can do more than they can do, although they can probably do it in the future. Talking about how all this affects the system, which Andrew alluded to. And I don't want to say anything to anger Andrew, because I like to drink beer with him. But this very easy to understand this. The system that North Korea has and always has had, and Bob Collins writes about this better than anybody, is not like China is. It's a guy in the middle, and all of the institutions feed into him. It was that way with Kim Il-sung. It was that way with Kim Jong-il. And as my good friend Pak Soon-jae said, he said the problem's going to be when Kim Jong-il dies. We know Kim Jong-il was weaker than his father. The next son will be weaker than Kim Jong-il. The question will be, how much weaker? And frankly, I don't think we know that yet, because we don't know if Kim Jong-un is going to be able to consolidate his power. But I agree with Andrew when he says this slow implosion thing. I think that's a great way of putting it. It could be tomorrow. It could be 30 years from now. So I think that's just something very important. Also, if I could respond to the proactive deterrence that South Korea has, and I have to say, and I'm sure you disagree, we are very polarized politically, obviously, but I would say proactive deterrence, preparing for a threat you know is coming, I'd say that's a good thing. I'd say planning is a good thing. And I'd say doing things like they did, for example, of forming the Northwest Islands Command, where they put a 2-star ROK Marine general in charge so that they'd be able to react more quickly, more efficiently, and have better command and control. Why would you not think that was a good thing? I think that they're going in the right direction, and I think they're being calm about it.
Okay.
So.
Right, James, you're going to get a very brief 2 fingers, and then we've got a great audience still here for the next half hour. We've got microphones, and we're going to take these first 2 questions up in the front as soon as James is done.
Sure. Let me tick off a couple of things. We talk about ranges about whether or not North Korea's nuclear weapons can hit Texas or New Jersey or Hawaii or whatever. This is a conversation allies hate to hear Americans having. I grew up in the UK during the 1980s, during the Reagan deployment of cruise missiles and Pershing 2s to Germany and to the UK. 2s went to Germany, and the idea of the Americans sort of being complacent about ranges of missiles and we're okay, SS-20s can't hit us or whatever. Sends a chill, and I'll tell you right now, from having recently come back to Tokyo, all you get asked about all the time by everybody, business leaders, military, is the United States' determination to stick to the alliance, to defend Japan in the event, and extended deterrence comes into that equation as well. So that's a dangerous conversation to have from the American point of view, and the Japanese and our other allies don't like it. When I say hedging, because you'd made the point, I didn't. The Japanese has aspiration. I'd say their desire for Korean unification is an aspirational idea, much like the United States and nuclear disarmament. Yes, we say this is our aspirational goal. We sure don't act like it. We don't operationally. We talk still extended deterrence and these sort of things. So that's where I say that the Japanese are hedging. They have an aspirational goal for Korean unification, but in the meantime, let's do that. And then we can address abductions later if you want.
Yes, sir.
Just one factual note, minor note on Japanese normalization process. You talked about 2015 dollars of $6 billion. My estimates cleared with my friend who knows much better than me about those things, was about $4 billion 2015 dollars. And that was 10% of what Japanese economy is supposed to have gotten benefit from Korean War. And then actually could...
And sir, if you could just quickly identify yourself with the speakers.
My name is Jay Ru,
Thank you.
One Korea Foundation, working also with One Korea Coalition. The discussions, as usual, as expected, were very, very informative and gave us a lot of food for thought, but it somehow did not really meet the title. There was a major powers, but not about Korean unification. Now, it is kind of odd because if you really look at it from another angle, ducks seem to be lined up in a nice, neat row for unification. The Chinese trouble with North Korea for the reasons Mr. Chang, eloquently presented. And then the United States faced with multifaceted threat from North Korea. And Japan hedging between, I'm pretty sure when all the hedging and agony of thoughts are over, I think they will still fall on South Korean system of unification when everything is said and done. Now, you wonder why, faced with all this very complex situation, the answer is there, and President Park gave in Dresden speech. Why people troubled with all this difficult and complex, unfathomable problem, and seeing the solution being suggested by one of the major powers in this context, South Korea. And we say, if South Korea wants it, you would help. South Korea said, we want it. Can't something like this happen? President Obama invite President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, South Korea's Park to Camp David, and wow, there's a deal.
Yeah.
What about a possibility like that? What about some force that can push for something like that? That's why we, of One Korea Foundation and Coalition, is trying to give public support for that policy movement. That's where we come from.
All right. Well, thank you for that thought, and we're going to hold on to it right now and just take a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
One quick question, maybe which requires some commentary. I'm Professor Lee Emeritus of International Law and International Relations. Maybe this is directed not specifically anybody, but maybe Mr. Chang or Mr. Kendall can answer. Mr. Chang tried to explain why the relationship getting worse between North Korea and China on the basis of this leadership. Xi Jinping, instability, Kim Jong-un, instability. But I think maybe we better approach more historically or geopolitical reasons. The reason is simply this. The China, which was a dolphin after the Civil War, now becoming whale. So always Korea is becoming small kind of shrimp. And then Mr. Kendall used this historical description, dagger pointing to Japan. I wish they were dagger. But historically, is a rabbit. Small shrimp, always victim. Look at the historically. Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War happened on Korean Peninsula. So the things we can maybe, I don't respect the Mao Zedong, even though President Roh Moo-hyun says he's the most respected Chinese leader. Amazingly, he said that kind of thing. But the lesson we could learn from the Mao, he always say that friendly neighbors is more dangerous than the faraway enemy. Richard Nixon took it that, okay, we could become their friend, let's restrain the Chinese power. So this is the lesson we have to apply in relationship with China. The China should be restrained by Japan and Korea under the leadership of United States. U.S. desperately need Japanese military and the Korean alliance. So when he was using this historical thing, modernization and the Japanese invasion, I think they should emphasize the importance of geopolitical reasons. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If we could just, Bradley Babson, we'll take a third question, maybe a fourth actually, and then we'll go to back to the panel, or maybe even five here. But, well, we'll come back to you, Bradley, in a minute. Let's go back there first. Yes, sir. Go ahead. You can go next.
Okay, my name is David Lee. I'm the president of KPAC, Korean American Public Affairs Committee. and also visiting Professor Gongju National University in Korea. So impressed Jim Landell, and I'm so much interested about what's going on in Japan. And also, I try to bridging the gap in between the animosity in between Japan and Korea. Is there any possibility we can more understandable? So my question is, Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, he tried to making normalizing a country, and rearmament, I don't know how much he could do it, but the statistics showing they are most like excuse me, senioralized country, which is older people, like the percentage of population, older people is too many, and also the population is shrink down, and also young generation is more like educated in American style. They don't like too much get into the military and all those things, and also their budget gap is very high. So his plan is viable in your professional point of view? That's my question. And also, is it real, their plan for engaging or deploying to Korean Peninsula by Japan? So if we could understand the situation of Japan and Korea, could it be not only Japan, the Korean people may not like deployment from Japan, but so does, if Japan has a problem, Korean army can go to Japan too. So I don't know which way they could understandable or whatever. For protecting U.S. interests in Asia, the two countries should be close to each other, more understandable. So personally, I hope to learn from you more about the Japanese situation. Just like you mentioning the senior official in Korean army, they don't have any like understanding of what's going on. So they just believe U.S. will come help them. What kind of procedure, what kind of logistics, how U.S. utilizing all those things. So in that angle, I hope to get your answer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Right here.
Yeah, thank you. Mark Tokolov from KEI. I've got a question about what China really wants. I've heard two arguments made. One is that what China really wants is U.S. forces off the peninsula. And they would make a deal with Seoul as long as that led to U.S. forces leaving the peninsula. The second argument is what China really wants is stability. So it'll try to deter the North Korean nuclear program, but also really can't admit it, but doesn't mind U.S. forces being on the peninsula because they deter both North and South Korea from doing anything provocative. As a footnote, I recall Dr. Kissinger referring to South America as a dagger pointed straight at the heart of Antarctica.
Exactly. A good point. And was there a fifth question out here? Yes, sir. Go ahead. We'll take your question.
Gentleman, Matt Romanowski. My question is that given the challenges we heard to unification in the last panel, if the assumption that a democratic North Korea seeks or would seek political union with South Korea turns out to be false due to an inability of the South and allied powers to provide for some of those challenges, do you think that would provide opportunities for the regional powers, and how would that interact, or how would that change the interaction between the regional powers if there was a democratic Northern Korea not politically unified with the South?
Thank you. We've heard 5 comments, if not questions. Everything from whether, if the president could call a unification summit, what would actually trigger that? I mean, I know it's not likely now, but I mean, can you imagine any circumstance when, maybe the president of the United States would be forced to get huddled together and try to force things together? The geostrategic factor, I mean, it's through your papers, but I think coming back to the question of to what extent is it really influencing their thought, these countries' sort of policies on unification would be interesting. Even on the Korea-Japan gap and Prime Minister Abe's defense plans, I think maybe, James, particularly the question about the Prime Minister's discussion about Korean contingencies, I think would be most appropriate for this discussion on unification. The important China question here, and finally, a very specific question about a democratic North Korea and the assumptions that we've been possibly operating under. But Gordon, we'll start with you, and we'll go right down the line all the way to our discussants as well.
I don't think China wants stability, because if you look at its borders from India in the south to South Korea in the north, they want territory which is under the control of others. And essentially they want to turn what is the international waters of the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. So you look at that in the context of what China is in fact doing, and you start talking about the Korean Peninsula, they don't want stability, they want control. And there are a number of different ways to get there, but all of them involve getting U.S. troops out of South Korea and off the peninsula. And so I think that essentially you can't say that China wants stability. We should say China should want stability, but that's not in fact what they want. This whole question about China as the whale in the Korean Peninsula issue is, I think, extremely important because we have this image of China, which went through 25 years of stability and rapid economic development, and indeed a rapid demographic increase. But what we have also seen in the last couple of years is a reversal of these trends, an attempt to close the country down, so therefore basically a reversal of reform and opening up. We've seen the end of the demographic dividend. We've seen political instability caused by a new leader coming in and trying to change the nature of the political system. So China going forward could be very, very different from the one that we got used to know. And so therefore, I think a lot of the assumptions we have about China are really out the window these days. And I'm not saying that China is going to go in one direction, which I think it will, but nonetheless, that China in a couple of years from now is going to be very different from the one today.
Camp David Summit. It's an interesting idea. There's one guy missing from the guest list. It was just Kim Jong-un. So I think they get a vote, whether we want, whether we like it or not. So that kind of set that up to one side. The trilateral ROK Japan-U.S. relationship. The United States would love it to be more, love it to be closer and stronger. I personally had the privilege of doing several U.S., Japan, Australia trilats, and I was very, very happy. Because my colleagues who did the Korea, Japan trilaterals were just, there's a great picture, I'm sure you've seen it, of President Obama sitting in the middle of a conference table with Park Geun-hye and Abe Shinzo on either side, kind of looking away from each other. It's kind of, that's the sort of role that the United States ends up playing, I think, a lot of times in that relationship, and is kind of mediating and going back and forth. Now, there's some good work I know that happens at, as the Navy would say, the deck plate level on some of these issues, but I think it's still rather fraught. As far as the military buildup, one of the things I like to point out to people who are concerned about this sort of resurgent Japanese militarism and Japan wants to turn back the clock and go back to the good old days of the early Showa period or something like that. I just say, look at the demographics. It doesn't support any of that. With 25% of your population over the age of 65, that's significant. If you look at the demographics of Japan in the early part of the 20th century, it was a very different situation. Overpopulation, very young population, couldn't feed itself, had to, the sort of Lebensraum idea that the Japanese had looked at. None of that is in existence. Japanese defense experts would dearly love to cut back the size of the ground self-defense force. Every single one I've talked to would love to do that. It's politically impossible for pork barrel reasons, and also because the ground self-defense force, as I discovered in firsthand, really is extremely important in a natural disaster-prone land like Japan is. So if you look at where they're really investing and what they're really doing, it's ships, missile defense, aircraft, joint strike fighter, this sort of thing, and a little bit into ground self-defense force. And that is aimed at an amphibious capability for outer island defense. The other thing with North Korea and the Japanese point of view, I really think they think in terms of missile defense with North Korea. So keeping them at bay. North Korea seldom comes up in conversation with my Japanese friends, whether they're military general officers, admirals, bureaucrats, it's always China. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. You could be talking about the weather. It's going to be China. The conversation is coming back around to China. That is their obsession. North Korea is an irritant. North Korea is something to be handled, to be managed, but it's not an overarching concern with the Japanese. And then finally, the NEO issue. This is a current, because of Kim Jong-un's disappearance from view last fall. You have this flurry of articles and flurry of speculations. That's probably why we're here talking about this right now. This reunification idea that this could actually happen. That, I think, spurred a lot of my friends and colleagues in Japan to go around and looking at the what-ifs. And the biggest one they came up to, besides missile defense, is the non-combatant evacuation operation. And again, that requires Korean cooperation, and I don't think that's going anywhere right now. Right.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I'll answer your question about a democratic DPRK first. I'm a firm believer in what my good friend and colleague Dave Maxwell calls North Korea, and that's the Kim family regime. It truly is. Come on, if we haven't figured that out yet, go back and read another book, because KFR, or Kim family regime, that whole regime is built around institutions and organizations that support the Kim family and that are outgrowths of the Kim family. Why do I say this? Because if the Kim family regime collapses, the country collapses. There has never been any other kind of government in North Korea. So why do we think the vacuum would be filled by Jeffersonian North Koreans who believe, I just don't see that happening. What I see happening, if the Kim family regime collapses, and it could be a slow boil, like he said, or a slow roll, what do you call it? Slow-mo. Collapse or a... Slow-mo implode. Exactly. But if you... whether it's slow or fast, when that happens, the void is most likely to be filled, in my view, by a unified Korea under a liberal democratic government in Seoul. So that's my opinion on that. No talk of missile ranges, I get it. But we didn't start this conversation when they invented the KN-08, nor did we start it when they had the Taepodong. We've been talking about North Korean missiles since they had Scud-Bs back in the 1980s. So, we've done everything we can to support our Japanese allies on that. We've sold them ballistic missile defense systems, the SM-3 and Aegis-equipped ships, etc. We're trying to talk the ROCs into going along with that. We'll see how that goes. And no, I don't believe that it's just to give Boeing guys jobs that we're doing it. I think it's a legitimate reason. Frankly, when a missile has a range that can hit the United States, that's a big deal, and it should be addressed, and I'm glad our public officials have said that. Finally, I'd just like to give a bravo Zulu, which, as you know, is da-did-it, da-da-did-it in Morse code, to Dr. Ree for your corollary with all the animals. It made me want to visit the Washington Zoo, but it was quite well done. That's all I got.
Dr. Andrew Scobell, any comments?
Okay, just want to answer or try and give my take on the question, what's China's bottom line on the Korean Peninsula? And I have to strongly disagree with my friend Gordon and say, China's bottom line is stability. Now, they may have a strange way of showing their concern, and there may be contradictions in their policies and actions that call us raise questions about that. But I think I take them at their word. Why do I take them at their word? Because I believe that the Communist Party leaders in Beijing are fundamentally insecure. Indeed, they're paranoid. They're extremely paranoid. They're worried about their own people. They're the People's Republic of China, and they're terrified of their own people, right? And they're also terrified about instability on their periphery. Hence, they have what I call a buffer strategy, which is to maintain a buffer around all around their borders. Now, they've been actually quite successful at this, and yet, we tend to think of China as being, growing more and more powerful and threatening to other countries, including the United States, or any fill in the blank, any country you like. But so it's hard to comprehend that Chinese leaders might see themselves surrounded by enemies and threats and dangers, and hence it's not incompatible with their efforts to try and maintain stability by being engaged in what many of China's neighbors and many people in this room would see as provocations. So as Professor Rod pointed out, it calls what's happened in North Korea, or what's happened on the Korean Peninsula, has called into question the indispensability of that North Korean buffer for China. However, because of this deep concern or insecurity that I mentioned, China's sticking with North Korea for now. And, Gordon mentioned of netizens in China, talking about, I've also looked at netizens in China. I'm involved in a research project that ran looking at what netizens in China are saying about North Korea. And some of them maybe are saying what Gordon was talking about, but a lot of them are saying those North Koreans are crazy, they're a pain in the neck, and they are danger to our country, and we ought to rethink that. Now, not that China's a democracy, we all know that, but Chinese leaders do pay attention to what their people are saying. Despite all these pressures and good reasons for China to abandon North Korea, it ain't going to happen, and I think I've explained why. Just one last point. I think that, and I've said this before, that China is not, in principle, opposed to Korean unification. Right? And yet, just like other countries that we've talked about, what they're worried about is not necessarily the outcome, it's the process. How do you get to that unification that worries the bejesus or the bamao out of Chinese leaders? And that's why they stick with this sorry excuse for a buffer that we like to call North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ross, some closing comments?
A very small personal point. It's not appropriate for me to inject my personal value in a scholarly discussion like this, but I don't want Dr. Bechtol to go home to Arizona with a misunderstanding of what I said. I not only endorse the preemptive, not preemptive, what did I say about the deterrence, yeah. But I bemoan the belated nature of it. I was only interested in how that introduction and late resurgence of that attitude on the part of the South reconfigures the relationship between North and South and China.
Good point. Good point. I think it has changed things. I think it may be why we haven't seen an actual violent provocation for a long time. I mean, we've seen brinkmanship, but no actual violent provocation, because maybe the North Koreans think, oh, this time the reaction is going to be stronger.
Right.
So anyway, good, well said.
I want to let the three paper writers close in the following 1 minute by offering up one big idea that relates to the topic of Korean unification, to go back to one of the points in the audience, in the major power that they're talking about. What is one important point, either one you've made, that you want to redistill, or even one that is you haven't made at this point? We can start actually with Bruce and just come back down this way. And then I know, I'm going to give you an extra chance because you had a biggest one, and I think North Korea is maybe the easiest thing to think about on unification.
I think that, talking about the North Korean military is an important aspect of unification. I know Pat agrees with me because he's written some great stuff on him that he's actually in my endnotes. But I think it's important to think about that in a symbolic way, not just a here's what a systems can do way, because things are done with specific intentions. And I think the North's intention appears to be that they want to continue to ratchet up the tension with their neighbor to the south. And the issue is, how do we get them away from that? And I'll just stop there.
Very important. James Kendall?
I think in the... I think what for Japan, an increasingly large concern of theirs is the orientation of South Korea to either Japan and the West, if you like, and China, the sort of natural orientation of Korea historically. I think this also is playing into their calculus of what's going to happen and how it might play out on the Korean Peninsula, and then also the intentions of the United States and our commitment to Asia. Those two things they see in large terms playing out, and the question isn't answered in their mind yet.
And Gordon Chang.
For those of us who lived through 1989, we saw a very benign scenario of the way a totalitarian superpower could fail. And we saw then, of course, the unification of Germany in ways which, of course, weren't perfect, but nonetheless have resulted in a very good situation for Europe. When you look at Asia, though, I don't think that we have those. The scenarios that I see are much more difficult because we have problems in North Korea. In the leadership, we have them with destructive weapons, the world's most destructive weapons. We got problems in China. And so all of these things, I think, are going to play out in ways that are going to be much worse than what we saw when the Soviet Union failed and when Eastern Europe democratized.
I'm going to turn it back over to Dave Maxwell in 1 minute, but would you first please join me in thanking these panelists and speakers. Wonderful job.